diplomatic transport, Harmonious Intent, emerged from Quantum Fold precisely on schedule, its beacon transmitting the standard arrival codes to Cerulean Station. 7 species, 14 delegates, 3 days of isolation negotiations with the Ntheri delegation to resolve border disputes in the Outer Veil. All life signs nominal, hull integrity perfect. Docking clamps engaged with the familiar pneumatic hiss of successful connection, but no one disembarked. Station Commander Yellis Thorne stood in the observation deck, her 6-fingered hands pressed against the transparasteel as she watched the airlock remain sealed. Beside her, the docking coordinator's antennae twitched with confusion. Life support readings are normal, the coordinator murmured, his compound eyes scanning the display. Atmospheric composition standard, no biological contaminants detected, power systems functioning. They're just sitting there. Thorne activated her Harmonious Intent. This is Cerulean Station Command. Acknowledge docking completion and prepare for debark procedures. Silence. Not the silence of empty space, but the silence of someone choosing not to answer. Send a secondary team, Thorne ordered, her voice tight. Full hazard protocols. Something's wrong. The boarding team entered 12 minutes later, weapons ready, sensors sweeping for threats. They found the delegates in the main conference chamber, seated around the central table, conscious, breathing, eyes open, completely silent. The team leader, a Viridian named Court, approached slowly, his crystalline exoskeleton refracting the chamber's light into nervous patterns. Are you injured? Do you require medical assistance? The delegates stared ahead, not at him, but through him. Finally, Ambassador Telvos, a Luxian whose cream-colored feathers usually ruffled with constant small movements, turned his head slowly, as though the action required immense effort. Invoke, he whispered, his translator barely catching the word. Human protocols. Then silence again. Within the hour, Cerulean Station had been locked down. Within 3 hours, the Galactic Concordat had escalated the incident to emergency status. Within 6 hours, every delegate had been medically cleared. No toxins, no pathogens, no neural damage. Physically, they were perfect. Psychologically, they had simply stopped speaking. The official statement released 8 hours after the Harmonious Intent's arrival contained exactly 43 words. The diplomatic delegation has returned safely from isolation negotiations. An incident occurred requiring human advisory intervention. All delegates are physically unharmed. Human psychological containment protocols are being implemented. No further details are available at this time. It was the phrase human psychological containment that made the galaxy's diplomatic channels erupt with questions. No such protocol existed in any official Concordat documentation. Yet somehow, when invoked, every human diplomatic facility across 9 sectors had responded immediately, as though they'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Veira Salant first learned of the incident the way most low-level researchers do, through a priority reassignment notification that appeared on her terminal without warning or explanation. One moment she'd been cataloging 3rd-century Delphine trade agreements. The next she was being pulled into something that required her species' unique empathic capabilities. The message was brief. Report to Concordat Central Investigation. Authorization, Oversight Council. Classification, restricted. Subject, Cerulean Incident Analysis. Your empathic assessment capabilities have been requested. Vera's bioluminescent patterns flickered with anxiety as she read it a second time. The Oversight Council didn't request low-level archivists. They didn't need empathic assessment for routine incidents. And they certainly didn't classify things as restricted unless something had gone profoundly wrong. She arrived at the Central Investigation Facility to find it operating under security conditions she'd only read about in theoretical protocols. Armed Viridian guards at every junction. Biometric verification at 3 separate checkpoints. Dampening fields that made her empathic senses feel muted, like trying to hear underwater. The briefing room held 5 other beings, 3 of whom she recognized from academic journals. Commander Jael Cortis sat with his crystalline structure reflecting the room's light in sharp angular patterns, his species equivalent of crossed arms and a skeptical expression. Beside him, Counselor Iara Fen, her avian features composed in careful neutrality. At the head of the table stood a human she didn't recognize, older perhaps 60 standard years, with gray threading through dark hair. His identification displayed simply, Ambassador Orin Thex, Human Diplomatic Corps. Thank you for coming on short notice, Thex began, his voice carrying that particular human quality of controlled calm that always made Vera's empathic senses uncertain. Humans were difficult to read, their emotions present, but somehow compartmentalized in ways her species found unsettling. You've all been briefed on the basic facts of the Cerulean incident. 14 delegates entered isolation negotiations. 3 days later, they returned physically unharmed, but psychologically unresponsive. Psychologically unresponsive is a diplomatic euphemism, Commander Cortis interrupted, his crystalline voice sharp with accusation. They've been rendered nearly catatonic. Whatever happened during those negotiations, nothing happened during the negotiations, Thex corrected gently. The negotiations never began. The delegates were infiltrated by Kovreth consciousness agents before the isolation period commenced. The room went silent. The Kovreth were known, distantly, theoretically, as a threat that operated 3 sectors beyond Concorda space. A hive species that expanded through psychological dominance rather than military conquest. Most species considered them a distant problem, something to worry about later. The Kovreth don't operate in Concorda space, Councillor Fenn said slowly, her feathers rippling with controlled alarm. We have no records of direct contact. Had no records, Thex amended. We do now. The infiltrators revealed themselves once the isolation period began. Standard Kovreth methodology. Demonstrate absolute superiority. Make resistance psychologically impossible. Offer integration as the only logical choice. Vera felt her bioluminescent patterns dimming with fear. And the delegates, did they integrate? No. Thex's expression didn't change. They invoked human advisory protocols instead. We responded. The situation was resolved. How? Cortis leaned forward, his structure refracting suspicion. And why won't any of the delegates speak about what happened? We've had 3 different cognitive specialists attempt interviews. All report the same thing. The delegates are conscious, aware, but refuse to discuss the incident. Not because they can't, because they won't. Thex was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, Vera noticed something in his tone, not defensiveness, but careful consideration. They won't speak because we showed them something we've been prepared to show for 80 years, since first contact. We call it Archive Zero. A weapon? Cortis asked immediately. No, Thex shook his head slowly. A record. Documentation. History. That's not an answer, Fenn observed. It's the only answer I can give you without showing you directly, Thex replied. Which is why you're all here. The Concordate Oversight Council has requested full disclosure of human advisory methods. We agree. But we need you to understand something first. He looked at each of them in turn. What we're going to show you will not harm you physically, but it will change how you think about humanity, permanently. Once you've seen Archive Zero, you cannot unsee it. Vera's empathic senses detected no deception in the human ambassador, but she felt something else, something that made her bioluminescence flicker with patterns of unease. Grief, maybe, or perhaps resignation. Are you saying, she asked carefully, that Archive Zero is traumatic? I'm saying, Thex replied, that it's true. The interview with Dr. Min Saravesh took place in a medical observation room designed for N-theory physiology. The walls were lined with bioneural interfaces that allowed Saravesh's species to maintain their comfortable level of consciousness sharing even when physically isolated. Saravesh herself sat in a membrane chair that supported her distributed nervous system, her translucent skin showing the faint shimmer of active neural pathways. Under normal circumstances, N-theory were among the most forthcoming species in the Concordate, their culture centered on shared experience and collective memory. Privacy was almost an alien concept to them. But when Vera entered and activated her empathic receptors, she felt only a wall of deliberate, structured silence. Dr. Saravesh, Vera began gently, settling onto a seat shaped for her amphibious physiology. I'm here to understand what happened during the Cerulean incident. I'm not here to judge or interrogate, just to understand. Saravesh's neural patterns flickered. I know what you are. Researcher Solent. Delphine empaths have impressive capabilities. You can sense deception, fear, hidden trauma. Her translator carried a strange tone. Not hostility, but something like protective firmness. I am not being deceptive. I am not suffering from trauma. I am choosing silence. Can you tell me why? A long pause. Then, because if I share what the humans showed us, it becomes part of the N-theory collective memory, and I will not burden my species with that knowledge unless absolutely necessary. Vera's bioluminescent patterns shifted to concerned amber. What could be so terrible that you would refuse to share it? Your entire culture is built on transparency. It's not terrible. Saravesh's neural patterns intensified. That's what makes it unbearable. The humans didn't show us horror, researcher. They showed us endurance, human endurance. She looked directly at Vera, and for the first time, the Delphine researcher felt something through her empathic senses. Not fear, not anger, but something closer to awe mixed with profound discomfort. Do you know what it's like to see 2,000 years of a species refusing to break? Not surviving heroically, not winning against odds, just continuing. Continuing when any logical being would have stopped. Continuing when continuing served no purpose except to remain themselves. I don't understand. I know. That's why I can't explain it. Saravesh's transparency flickered. If you want to understand, ask the humans to show you what they showed us. But I warn you, Researcher Solent, your empathic capabilities will make it worse. You'll feel what those historical humans felt, and you'll have to confront the question that I still cannot answer. What question? Saravesh's neural patterns pulsed once, sharply. What kind of species continues being human, even when being human means suffering? Commander Jael Cortis made his skepticism clear from the moment he entered the investigation briefing. His crystalline structure caught and refracted the room's light in patterns that his species used to convey aggressive certainty. This is psychological theater, he announced, not bothering with diplomatic preamble. The humans have created a narrative designed to elevate their status. The delegates are experiencing shared suggestibility, nothing more. Counselor Fenn's feathers ruffled slightly. 3 separate cognitive specialists have confirmed the delegates are not under any form of suggestion or manipulation. Then they're choosing to play along with human dramatics. Cortis's structure flashed with dismissive colors. Consider the timing. The Kavreth are a distant threat. Convenient that they suddenly appear in Concorda space. Convenient that only human intervention could resolve the situation. Convenient that the resolution requires these mysterious new protocols that grant humans special operational authority. Vera, who had been reviewing interview transcripts, looked up. You think the humans fabricated the entire incident? I think humans excel at narrative manipulation, Cortis replied. They're masters of storytelling. It's embedded in their culture, creating a crisis that only they can solve. That's strategic positioning, not emergency response. Ambassador Thex, who had been listening quietly from the corner, finally spoke. Commander Cortis, I appreciate your skepticism. It's a reasonable position. But I want to clarify something. We didn't create this situation. We've been preparing for it since first contact, because we knew eventually we'd encounter a species that uses psychological dominance. We prepared Archive Zero not as a weapon or a strategic asset. We prepared it as an explanation. An explanation of what? Cortis challenged. Of why you should never try to psychologically dominate a human. Tachias's expression remained calm, but Vera's empathic senses detected something beneath the surface. Not anger, something more like sorrow. We don't want other species to fear us, Commander, but we need them to understand us, and understanding requires evidence. Then show me this evidence, Cortis demanded. Show me what has these delegates so terrified that they won't speak. They're not terrified, Thex corrected gently. They're careful. There's a difference. He looked at Vera, then Fenn, then back to Cortis. If you're all willing, we can arrange a controlled viewing, but I need each of you to understand. This isn't something we show to intimidate or impress. This is something we show to explain. Explain what? Vera asked. Thex was quiet for a moment before answering. Explain why the kindest thing the galaxy can do is never put humanity in a position where endurance is our only option. Technician Pel Undros was 7 hours into a routine shift when the investigation team finally tracked him down. The Graven maintenance engineer had been reinstalling thermal couplings in Sector 4's environmental control junction when Commander Cortis and Researcher Solent appeared, requesting an interview about power consumption patterns. Pel's 4 arms continued working as he spoke, his chitinous exoskeleton clicking softly with each movement. Yeah, I noticed the anomaly. About 4 days ago, maybe. Sector 7 Undercroft pulled enough power to run a city block for 3 days straight. Sector 7 Undercroft. Vera checked her datapad. That's listed as auxiliary storage. There shouldn't be significant power draw there. Exactly. Pel secured a coupling and shifted to the next junction. So I filed a standard maintenance inquiry. Got a response within minutes, which never happens, by the way. Response came directly from Human Diplomatic Corps. Said they were running climate-controlled archival access and had proper authorization. He paused, antennae twitching with remembered curiosity. Thing is, the power usage wasn't just volume, it was specific. They were maintaining precise environmental conditions. What kind of conditions? Cortis asked. Human optimal. Temperature 20 degrees Celsius plus or minus half a degree. Humidity 45%. Air filtration at medical grade levels. Pel's mandibles clicked in what his species used to convey puzzlement. I've done maintenance for embassies across 9 species. Nobody maintains those kinds of tolerances for storage access. That's the kind of environmental control you use for sensitive biological operations. Or, he trailed off. Or what? Vera prompted. Or for keeping someone comfortable during something difficult. Pel finished the coupling and turned to face them fully. Look, I'm just a technician, but I've worked around enough different species to recognize preparation when I see it. The humans weren't improvising. They'd set up a viewing room, comfortable seating, precisely controlled environment, medical monitoring equipment in standby mode. They were getting ready to show someone something that might be hard to watch. Vera's bioluminescent patterns flickered with realization. They were preparing 3 days before the delegates returned. Yeah. Pel's antennae drooped slightly, which means either they knew the Kuvreth were coming, or they're always ready. Not sure which possibility concerns me more. The formal request for disclosure went through 12 layers of concordant authorization before reaching Ambassador Thex's desk. Vera participated in the council session via HoloLink, watching as various species representatives debated whether forcing transparency from the human diplomatic corps was legally justified. The delegates' continued silence constitutes a potential security risk, argued a Cerelian councillor, his thought orbs pulsing with administrative concern. We cannot have 14 representatives from 7 species unable or unwilling to report on a crisis incident. The humans have offered to provide full disclosure, Councillor Fenn reminded the assembly. They're not resisting, they're simply asking that we understand the context of what we're about to see, which sounds like pre-excuse justification, Commander Cortis interjected. Make us anticipate something disturbing, so that when they show us standard defense recordings, we're already primed to see them as significant. The debate continued for 2 hours before the Oversight Council issued their ruling, full disclosure authorized, with human advisory protocols regarding viewing conditions respected. If the humans wanted to control the environment in which Archive 0 was shown, that was acceptable, as long as what was shown was complete and unedited. The notification reached Vera that evening. Disclosure viewing scheduled for tomorrow, 0900 station time, Sector 7 Undercroft, Human Archive Facility, attendance mandatory. She spent that night reviewing everything she could find about human military history, diplomatic records, cultural documentation. The humans had been part of the Concordat for 80 years, not long by galactic standards, but long enough to establish patterns. They were considered reliable allies, creative problem solvers, culturally adaptable but emotionally complex. Nothing she read prepared her for what Archive 0 might contain. At 0850 the next morning, she stood outside the entrance to Sector 7 Undercroft with Commander Cortis, Councillor Fenn, and 3 other species representatives. The door was unmarked except for a small plaque. Human Historical Archive, authorized access only. Ambassador Thex met them personally. Behind him stood an elderly human woman with silver hair pulled back severely, her face lined with what Vera's empathic senses read as profound, long-held sorrow. This is historian Calum Vey, Thex introduced. She is the guardian of Archive 0. What you're about to see has been under her stewardship for 8 decades. Calum's voice was soft but carried an unexpected weight. Before we enter, I need each of you to understand what Archive 0 is, and what it is not. It is not propaganda. It is not military recruitment material. It is not edited for emotional impact. It is primary source documentation of human history, specifically selected for one criterion: psychological endurance under conditions where survival was statistically impossible. Why would you preserve such records? Fenn asked gently. Because, Calum replied, we knew that someday, someone in the galaxy would try to dominate humanity psychologically, and we needed proof that it doesn't work. She led them inside. The facility beyond was nothing like Vera had imagined. She'd expected a sterile archive, cold storage, rows of data crystals. Instead, she found something that felt almost sacred. The walls were lined with physical artifacts, photographs under protective glass, handwritten documents in preservation cases, objects that looked ancient and carefully maintained. The viewing room itself was exactly as Pel had described, environmentally controlled, comfortable seating arranged in a gentle arc facing a large display screen, medical monitoring equipment, standing quietly in the corners. Please sit, Calum gestured. I'll begin with context. They settled into seats that adjusted to their various physiologies. The lights dimmed slightly. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Earth standard, Calum began, humanity experienced what we now call the documentation era. For the first time in our species' history, we could record our experiences comprehensively in photographs, film, audio, and eventually digital formats. This means we have detailed primary source evidence of some of our worst moments, not legend, not mythology, actual documentation. The screen flickered to life, showing a map of Earth with various locations highlighted. What you're about to see is a small sample from Archive 0. These are records of humans enduring conditions that, by any logical assessment, should have resulted in psychological collapse. They did not. That is not a boast. It is simply what happened. The first image appeared on screen. It was a photograph, black and white, slightly grainy, the way very old images looked. It showed a narrow street lined with crumbling buildings. Children sat on the street, not playing, but simply sitting. Their faces looked old despite their youth. Warsaw, Poland, 1943, Calum narrated quietly. During Earth's second global conflict, the German fascist government forced Jewish populations into enclosed districts called ghettos. This is the Warsaw Ghetto. Over 400,000 humans were forced into an area designed for 100,000. Starvation, disease, and systematic deportation to extermination camps were constant. Vera's empathic senses detected nothing from the photograph itself. It was too old, too removed. But she felt the tension in the room as other species representatives processed what they were seeing. The logical response, Calum continued, would be complete despair. Instead, the humans in the Warsaw Ghetto organized. They created schools in secret. They documented their experiences, knowing they would likely not survive to share them. And when deportations to death camps began, they prepared for armed resistance. New images appeared. Handmade weapons, maps drawn on scraps of paper, faces of young people, some barely adults. They knew they could not win militarily. The German forces had overwhelming superiority in numbers, training and equipment. The ghetto fighters had perhaps a few hundred small arms between them, but they chose to resist anyway. Not because they believed they would survive, but because they refused to be passive. Footage began to play. Old silent film showing buildings burning, streets barricaded with rubble, figures moving between ruins. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising lasted 27 days. The fighters inflicted enough casualties that German command had to bring in artillery and systematically burn the ghetto block by block. Almost all the resistance fighters died, but they died having chosen their terms. The screen went dark for a moment. Commander Cortes spoke, his voice unusually quiet. "This is your example? Mass death? No." Calum replied, "The example is what they did while facing mass death. Look." She advanced the display to show a photograph of a makeshift classroom. Adults teaching children in a basement, everyone thin and exhausted, but the children holding books. They maintained schools, Calum said, during starvation, during deportations, during the uprising itself, because being human to them meant continuing to be human regardless of circumstances. Vera felt something shifting in her understanding. This wasn't about military strength or tactical brilliance. This was about something else entirely. The next section showed Antarctic exploration, journals written by men freezing to death, still recording observations, medical experiments conducted by doctors on themselves when subjects weren't available, concentration camp prisoners who organized secret networks to protect children, knowing they'd be killed if discovered, doing it anyway. Each example followed the same pattern, humans facing impossible situations, logically analyzing their hopelessness, and then continuing to act as though hope existed. Siege warfare, where surrounded populations maintained orchestras and theater productions. Prison camps where inmates created universities. Disaster survivors who established democratic governance while still trapped in rubble. Explorers stranded on hostile environments who maintained detailed logs, even as supplies ran out. This is not exceptional to humanity, Calum explained as the footage continued. This is normal. This is what humans do when there are no good options. We continue being human. We organize. We document. We teach. We resist. Not because we believe we'll survive, but because survival isn't the only metric we measure ourselves by. Vera's bioluminescence had dimmed to almost nothing. Beside her, Councillor Fenn's feathers had stopped moving entirely. Even Commander Cortes's crystalline structure had shifted to muted colors. The final sequence showed something different, more recent footage from human colony ships during the early expansion era. Technical failures, life support malfunctions, situations where survival was measured in hours. In every case, the humans continued working, continued documenting, continued functioning as though they had time they clearly didn't have. What makes this relevant to the Kvreth incident, Calum said as the lights gradually returned, is understanding what psychological dominance means to different species. For most of the galaxy, psychological dominance works because it's logical. When resistance is mathematically futile, the logical response is negotiation or surrender. The Kvreth evolved in a context where that logic was universal. She turned to face the assembled representatives. Humans are not illogical. We understand when situations are hopeless. We simply don't stop being human when we understand that. The Kvreth cannot process this. Their entire psychological framework depends on their targets accepting futility. We don't accept futility. We acknowledge it and continue anyway. The room was silent. Finally, Commander Cortes spoke. "You showed this to the delegates." "A similar selection, yes." Ambassador Thex confirmed. "When the Kvreth began their dominance demonstration, the delegates invoked human protocols. We transported them here and showed them Archive 0. Then we told them, these are the beings whose descendants stand beside you. If the Kavreth try to dominate us, this is what they will encounter, not once but as a fundamental species trait. And the Kavreth, the delegates were still linked to the Kavreth consciousness network, Vex explained. They were intended to carry the experience of psychological submission back to the hive. Instead, they carried back the experience of viewing Archive Zero. The Kavreth infiltrators attempted to process what they were sensing through the link. Documentation of a species that simply does not respond to psychological dominance as expected. It created a logic cascade in their network consciousness. The infiltrators collapsed neurologically. Vavrethis found her voice. You weaponized your own history. No, Calum corrected gently. We showed them the truth. Whether that functions as a weapon depends entirely on whether someone tries to psychologically dominate us. For allies, it's just history. For the Kavreth, it was incomprehensible. Dr. Saravesh agreed to a second interview, 3 days after Vavrez's viewing of Archive Zero. They met in the same medical observation room, but this time, Vavrer understood the silence differently. You've seen it now, Saravesh said as soon as Vavrer entered. It wasn't a question. Yes, then you understand why I won't share it with the Entheri collective memory. Saravesh's neural patterns pulsed slowly, deliberately. If I share what I experienced, what I felt while watching those records, it becomes part of us permanently. And I'm not certain my species should carry that knowledge. Why? Vera settled into her seat, her empathic receptors open but gentle. Because it changes the calculations, Saravesh replied. Every species in the Concordat operates on certain assumptions about behavior under pressure. We assume that beings act rationally. We assume that when presented with futility, creatures negotiate survival. That's how societies function. That's how wars end. That's how peace becomes possible. She paused, her translucency shifting with emotional complexity.
Humans break those assumptions. They don't break them through irrationality or madness. They break them through choice. They see the futility. They understand it perfectly. And then they choose to continue being human anyway, even when being human guarantees suffering. And this terrifies you? Not terrifies. Disturbs. Saravesh's neural patterns intensified. Because it means that in any conflict with humanity, surrender isn't truly an option. Oh, they'll accept surrender. They'll negotiate peace. But if you push them to a point where they have nothing left to lose, they won't stop. They'll endure. And endurance, researcher Solent, is more frightening than any weapon because you can't negotiate with it. Vera's bioluminescent patterns flickered with understanding. The delegates aren't silent because they're traumatized. They're silent because they're being careful. Exactly. Saravesh's form seemed to relax slightly. They're protecting the rest of the galaxy from knowledge that might change how we relate to humanity. Better that most species continue to see humans as creative, adaptable allies rather than understanding what they really are. What are they? Saravesh was quiet for a long moment. Survivors who refuse to stop surviving even when survival stops making sense. That's not a criticism, researcher. It's just profoundly alien in a way that superior technology or strange biology never could be. The Concordat Oversight Council met in emergency session to address the findings. Vera submitted her formal assessment, as did Commander Cortis, Councillor Fenn, and the other viewing participants. The session was closed. No public record, no media access. Councillor Fenn spoke first after the reports were read. We need to address 2 questions. First, did the humans act appropriately in their response to the Kavreth infiltration? Second, what protocols should govern future incidents involving human psychological intervention methods? Before we address those, another councillor interjected, a Cerelian whose thought orbs pulsed with administrative precision. We need to acknowledge what the reports indicate. The humans have been preparing this Archive Zero response for 8 decades, since first contact. They anticipated this exact situation. Is that concerning? Fenn asked. It's revealing, Commander Cortis answered, surprising everyone. The Viridians' tone had changed since viewing the archive. They weren't preparing to intimidate us. They were preparing to explain themselves. There's a difference. Explain what? Precisely. The Cerelian councillor pressed. Cortis's crystalline structure refracted thoughtful colors. Explain why attempting to psychologically dominate humanity is fundamentally ineffective. Most species would respond to a threat like the Kavreth with military force. Humans responded with documentation. They showed the Kavreth, through the delegates' connection, that psychological dominance simply doesn't work on their species. Not because they're stronger, but because they're structured differently. Is that dangerous to the Kavrotat? Another councillor asked. Dangerous, Finn's feathers ruffled with what might have been wry amusement. They could have kept Archive Zero secret. They could have used it exclusively for strategic advantage. Instead, they've offered full disclosure to anyone who asks. That's not dangerous behavior. That's transparent behavior. Transparent, Vera spoke up, but unsettling. The reports all indicate the same thing. Understanding human psychological resilience changes how we perceive them. Not as a threat, but as something we need to be careful with. Careful how? The Cerulean counselor asked. Vera chose her words cautiously. Most species, when pushed to extremity, will break or negotiate. Humans will endure. That means in any conflict involving humanity, de-escalation becomes critical because escalation has no logical endpoint. They won't stop. They'll just continue being human, regardless of cost. The chamber fell quiet as the implications settled. Finally, the senior oversight counselor, an ancient Octavian whose tentacles had faded to pale gray, spoke. Then our protocol must reflect that understanding. We need policies that ensure humanity is never pushed to positions where endurance becomes their only option. Not to protect the galaxy from humans, but to protect humans from situations that would force them to demonstrate exactly how far their endurance extends. You're proposing protective restrictions, Fen asked. I'm proposing careful integration, the senior counselor corrected. Human psychological containment protocols should serve two functions: restrict access to Archive Zero to prevent destabilization, and establish guidelines ensuring humanity is never systematically isolated or cornered. They are our allies. We should treat them with the respect that requires. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Human psychological containment protocols would be implemented, not as punishment or restriction, but as acknowledgement. Archive Zero would be classified at the highest level, accessible only under crisis authorization. Human advisory methods would be formally recognized as a legitimate diplomatic tool. And most significantly, a new provision would be added to concordate mutual defense treaties. Member species agree to prevent conditions that would force human populations into survival-only scenarios, recognizing that such circumstances could destabilize broader regional dynamics. It was in essence a promise. We will not push you to the edge, because we understand what happens when you're pushed to the edge. Vera's final meeting with Ambassador Thex took place in his office. A surprisingly modest space decorated with artifacts from Earth, physical books on wooden shelves, a painting of a shoreline, a small plant in careful cultivation. Your report was thorough, Thex said, gesturing for her to sit. The Oversight Council has informed us of their decision. The protocols will be implemented next quarter. Are you satisfied with the outcome? Vera asked. Thex considered the question carefully. Satisfied? I'm not sure that's the right word. Relieved, perhaps. We've been carrying Archive Zero for 80 years, wondering if we'd ever need to show it, wondering if showing it would help or hurt human integration into the Concorder. And now the galaxy knows, Thex replied simply. They know what we are. They know what we've endured. They know why trying to dominate us psychologically is futile. That knowledge comes with costs. We'll be viewed differently now, more carefully, but it also comes with honesty. We'd rather be understood accurately than liked inaccurately. Vera's bioluminescent patterns shifted to contemplative blue. Dr. Saravesh told me something that I keep thinking about. She said humans break fundamental assumptions about behavior under pressure. You choose to continue being human, even when being human means suffering. That's accurate, Thex acknowledged. Can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you see that as a strength or a curse? Thex was quiet for a long moment, looking at the painting on his wall, the shoreline, waves meeting sand, constant motion. Both, he said finally. It's kept us alive as a species. It's allowed us to survive things that should have destroyed us. But it also means we carry memories that other species might have been able to forget. Every human grows up learning about the Warsaw Ghetto, about Antarctic explorers, about concentration camps and sieges, and all the times our ancestors faced the impossible and refused to stop being human. He turned back to her. We're shaped by that history. It's in our literature, our philosophy, our cultural assumptions. We don't see endurance as exceptional. We see it as what you do. Is that why you prepared Archive Zero so carefully? To show that this isn't manipulation, but just who you are. Exactly. Thex smiled slightly. We didn't want other species to fear us, but we needed them to understand that psychological dominance tactics, the kind the Kavreth use, simply won't work. Not because we're strong, but because we're stubborn in very specific ways. Vera found herself returning the smile, her empathic senses detecting genuine warmth from the human ambassador. The protocols being implemented, do you think they'll help? I think they'll do what they're intended to do, prevent misunderstandings. Make sure that if conflict arises, it's resolved before it reaches a point where all humanity can do is endure, because the galaxy is right to be careful about that. Once we're in survival mode, we don't really have an off switch. We just continue. That's what disturbs people, Vera observed. The continuing, even when continuing serves no strategic purpose. I know, Vex's expression became more serious. But that's also what makes us valuable allies. When things are truly desperate, when logic says to give up, humans won't. We'll find a way, or we'll keep trying until circumstances change. That reliability comes with uncomfortable implications, but it's also why we've been successful in the Concord. You can count on us to endure. As Vera prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Ambassador, one more question. Archive 0 contains records from thousands of years of human history, but you only showed us a small selection. How much more is there? Vex's smile faded slightly. Enough that we'll never run out of examples, which is its own kind of tragedy. Researcher Solent. Every entry in Archive 0 represents human suffering and continuing. We're not proud of having so much material. We're just honest about what it means. 3 months after the incident, Vera attended a memorial service for the Cerulean negotiations that never happened. The delegates had gradually returned to normal functioning, speaking, working, resuming their duties. But all of them had requested that a marker be placed in the station's memorial garden, acknowledging what had occurred. The plaque was simple, in recognition of the delegates who faced the Kavreth infiltration and the humans who showed them that psychological dominance has limits. May we never forget that endurance is both a gift and a burden. Dr. Saravesh stood beside Vera during the ceremony, her translucent form catching the garden's artificial sunlight. I've decided to share my memories of the incident with the Entheri Collective, she said quietly. Not the full Archive 0 viewing that remains private, but my experience of understanding what humans are capable of enduring. The collective voted. They want to know. That's a significant decision, Vera observed. It is, but keeping it private felt like denying truth. The humans were willing to show us their worst moments to explain themselves. The least I can do is share what I learned. Commander Cortus approached, his crystalline structure reflecting subdued, respectful colors. Researcher Solent, Dr. Saravesh. He nodded to each of them. I wanted to apologize for my earlier skepticism. I was wrong about human intentions. You were doing your job, Vera replied. Skepticism is appropriate in security analysis, perhaps, but I confused tactical caution with understanding. His structure shifted slightly. I've recommended that Viridian military academies incorporate human endurance case studies into psychological resilience training. Not to copy their methods. We can't. Our psychology is structured differently, but to understand that endurance itself can be a strategic factor. The humans will probably be willing to share materials, Vera suggested. They already have. Cortus's tone carried what might have been rueful respect. Responded within hours of my request. Provided curated selections appropriate for non-human psychology, along with detailed context notes. They've apparently been preparing educational materials for decades, just waiting for species to ask. After the ceremony, Vera returned to her archive work, but she found her thoughts kept returning to Archive 0, not to the specific images or footage, but to the pattern they represented. Humans enduring, humans continuing, humans refusing to stop being human regardless of circumstances. It was, she realized, the most alien thing she'd encountered in her entire career. Not because it was incomprehensible, but because it was comprehensible, but still felt impossible. She could understand the logic or lack thereof that drove humans to continue when continuation was futile. She could see the cultural and evolutionary factors that shaped that response. She could empathically sense the emotions involved, but she still couldn't quite believe that an entire species operated that way. That evening, she began drafting her final report for the Concordat Central Archives, the official documentation of the Cerulean incident, including her assessment of Archive 0 and its implications for Concordat human relations. She wrote, "Humanity represents a unique challenge for interspecies relations, a species whose fundamental approach to crisis is neither fight nor flight, but endurance. They do not endure because they are uniquely strong or technologically superior. They endure because endurance is, to them, simply what one does. This has profound implications for how other species should engage with humanity in conflict scenarios. Psychological dominance tactics are ineffective. Intimidation strategies that rely on demonstrating futility will fail. Humans acknowledge futility and continue regardless. This is not a threat assessment. This is a relationship management consideration. Humanity will be a reliable ally precisely because they will not abandon commitments even when maintaining those commitments becomes difficult. But this also means that pushing humanity into corner scenarios should be avoided whenever possible. They will not break. They will not negotiate from desperation. They will simply endure until circumstances change or they cannot physically continue. The Concordate's decision to implement human psychological containment protocols reflects wisdom in recognizing these dynamics. We are not restricting humanity out of fear, but managing our relationship with them out of respect for their nature. They have shown us who they are. The appropriate response is to ensure we never create circumstances that would force them to demonstrate the full extent of their endurance capabilities. Recommendation: continued integration of humanity into Concordate activities with enhanced awareness of their psychological resilience patterns. They are valuable allies. They are also beings whose friendship should be maintained carefully, not because they are dangerous, but because they are capable of endurance that most species find disturbing when observed directly. Personal observation: I am grateful that humans are our allies. I am grateful that I will likely never see them pushed to the edge of their endurance capabilities. And I am grateful that they chose to share Archive Zero with us, despite knowing it would change how we see them. That choice to be known truly rather than comfortably is perhaps the most human thing about them. She submitted the report 3 days later. It was filed, classified appropriately, and added to the permanent record of the Cerulean incident. 6 months after the incident, Vera received an unexpected invitation. Ambassador Thex requested her presence at a small ceremony in Sector 7 Undercroft. When she arrived, she found historian Calum Vey waiting with a small group, the other species representatives who had viewed Archive Zero, plus a handful of humans she didn't recognize. "Thank you for coming," Calum said. Her elderly features warmed despite the solemnity of the space. "We're adding a new section to Archive Zero today. We wanted witnesses." "A new section?" Vera asked. "Documentation of this incident," Calum explained. "The Cerulean situation, the Kvreth infiltration, the implementation of containment protocols, and the responses of non-human species to viewing Archive Zero." She gestured to a new display case being installed. Inside, Vera saw her own report, along with Cortis's analysis, Fenn's council summary, and Saravesh's eventual testimony to the Entheri Collective. "Why would you archive our responses?" Commander Cortis asked, his crystalline structure reflecting confusion. Calum smiled gently. "Because Archive Zero isn't just about human endurance, it's about what that endurance means in a broader context. You saw our history and understood us better. Your understanding, your careful responses, your decision to implement protective protocols rather than restrictive ones, that's part of the story too. That's evidence that endurance doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in relationship." She activated the display case, and Vera saw her own words illuminated. "They are valuable allies. They are also beings whose friendship should be maintained carefully. You responded to our transparency with thoughtfulness," Ambassador Thex added, stepping forward. "You could have reacted with fear or imposed harsh restrictions. Instead, you chose understanding. That matters. That's worth documenting. So future species who view Archive Zero," Councillor Fenn said slowly, understanding dawning, "will see not just human endurance, but also how the Concordate responded to learning about it." "Exactly," Calum confirmed, "because the point was never to make other species fear us. The point was to be understood, and understanding requires context from all sides." Vera felt her bioluminescent patterns shifting through complex colors as emotions washed through her empathic senses. Pride at being included in the archive, humility at seeing her words treated as historically significant, and something else, a strange sense of connection to these humans who documented everything, even their own vulnerability. "Will there be more additions to Archive Zero?" she asked. "Probably," Calum admitted. "Every time humanity endures something that seems impossible, we document it. Not because we're proud of suffering, but because we want honest records. And now, every time other species respond to that documentation with wisdom rather than fear, we'll document that too. Because that's part of our story now, not just human endurance, but the relationships that endurance exists within." The ceremony was brief. Calum formally activated the new section, spoke a few words about the importance of mutual understanding, and then invited everyone to share a meal in the adjacent chamber, human food prepared to accommodate various species' digestive requirements. As they ate, Vera found herself sitting beside one of the humans she didn't recognize, a young woman who introduced herself as Lieutenant Kara Walsh. "I'm being assigned to Ambassador Thex's staff," Walsh explained, "specializing in interspecies psychological cooperation protocols. Basically, I'll help implement the new containment guidelines." "That must be a challenging position," Vera observed. "It is, but it's important work." work. Walsh smiled slightly. Humans are used to being misunderstood. We're not used to being understood carefully. The Concordat's response, your report especially, researcher gave us something unexpected. Not just acceptance, but considerate acceptance. That matters. Does it bother you? Vera asked. Being viewed as beings who need to be handled carefully. Walsh considered the question. I think every species should be handled carefully. Understanding someone's nature and respecting it. That's not insulting. That's friendship. She paused. Would it be better if other species ignored human psychological patterns and then were surprised when we acted according to our nature? This way is more honest. Vera's empathic senses detected genuine contentment from the young human. You're not worried about being seen as dangerous. We are dangerous, Walsh replied simply, in specific circumstances, but so is every species if pushed right. The difference is, humans are dangerous in predictable ways. We endure, we don't break, we keep functioning when we shouldn't. Now the Concordat knows that. They can plan around it. That makes us better allies, not worse ones. As the gathering continued, Vera watched the interactions between humans and other species with new understanding. The humans weren't trying to intimidate or impress. They were simply being present, being themselves, being honest about their nature. And the other species, even Commander Cortis, once so skeptical, responded with respect rather than fear. Not because humans had proven themselves harmless, but because they'd proven themselves comprehensible, dangerous in specific ways, yes, but knowable, understandable, predictable enough to work with. Vera's final entry in her personal research log, written late that night in her quarters, was not for official records. It was for herself. I thought I understood what makes humanity unique. I thought it was their creativity, their adaptability, their emotional complexity. Those things matter, but they're not the core of it. What makes humanity unique is that they've been counting the cost of being human for thousands of years, and they keep choosing to pay it. They document their suffering with clinical precision. They archive their worst moments with careful preservation. They study their own endurance, like it's a natural phenomenon to be measured and analyzed, and then they continue being exactly what they are, knowing full well what that costs. That's not strength in any conventional sense. It's something stranger. It's the conscious choice to remain themselves regardless of circumstances. The Kovreth couldn't process it because their psychology depends on targets making logical calculations about futility. Humans make those same calculations. They see the futility clearly. Then they ignore it and continue anyway, not out of ignorance but out of choice. I spent months trying to understand if that makes them superior or simply different. I've concluded it's neither. And being human is something that can only be understood by watching what humans do when being human becomes difficult. They showed us Archive Zero not to threaten us but to explain. This is what we are. This is what we've always been. If you understand this, you'll understand why certain tactics don't work on us and why we're reliable in ways that might seem impossible. The Concordat's response, implementing protective protocols rather than restrictive ones, was wise. We're not containing humanity. We're respecting their nature. We're ensuring that we never accidentally push them into situations where all they can do is endure, because I've seen what human endurance looks like, documented across millennia, and the most terrifying thing about it isn't the endurance itself. It's that they don't see it as exceptional. To humans, enduring the impossible is just what you do when circumstances require it. No special heroism, no extraordinary measures, just humans being human, continuing even when continuing makes no logical sense, because that's what humans do. I'm glad they're our allies. I'm glad I'll likely never see them pushed to extremity, and I'm grateful that they trusted us enough to show us who they really are, knowing we might react with fear. We didn't fear them, we understood them, and understanding, I think, is what they wanted most. 3 years later. The memorial garden at Cerulean Station had grown. New plants from 7 species homeworlds intermingled now, a living representation of cooperation. Vera visited whenever her research brought her to the station, finding peace in the quiet space. Today she found she wasn't alone. Dr. Saravesh sat beside the memorial plaque, her translucent form still contemplative. Researcher Solent Saravesh greeted. It's been months. Dr. Saravesh, you're looking well. I am well. The Antheri Collective has processed my shared memories. It's changed some things, but not in bad ways. Her neural patterns pulse gently. We understand humanity better now. We've actually begun exchanging cultural liaisons more regularly, learning from each other. That's good to hear. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Saravesh spoke again. You know what the strangest thing is? The more we interact with humans, the more normal they seem. Their endurance doesn't feel alien anymore. It just feels like Kara working late to finish a project, Ambassador Thex remaining patient through difficult negotiations, Historian Vi preserving records with meticulous care, small acts of endurance happening constantly, unremarkably. Maybe that's the real revelation, Vira suggested. Not that humans can endure dramatically, but that they endure constantly, in small ways, without thinking of it as special. Saravesh's form shimmered with something like contentment. I heard you've been promoted. Senior Cultural Analyst. Yes, thanks in part to my work on the Cerulean incident. Apparently, being able to understand humanity is considered a valuable skill now. As it should be. They're among our most important allies. A human walked past. A young maintenance technician Vera didn't recognize. He nodded politely to both of them, then continued his work, checking environmental systems. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Just another being doing their job. But Vera watched him with new understanding. Somewhere in his ancestors' history, someone had endured something impossible, and continued. That history shaped him, informed his culture, made him what he was, and he would probably go his entire life without thinking of it as exceptional. That, Vera thought, was perhaps the most human thing of all. Come on, Saravesh said, rising. I heard there's a new joint research project forming. Antheri memory sharing techniques combined with human historical documentation methods. They're looking for analysts. Interested. Vera stood, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to curious greens and blues. Very interested. As they walked away from the memorial garden, Vera glanced back once at the plaque commemorating the incident that had changed so much. Not through violence or conquest, but through understanding. The humans had shown the galaxy who they were. The galaxy had chosen to understand rather than fear. And from that understanding, something new was growing. Relationships built on truth rather than comfort, on respect rather than power, on careful acknowledgement of each species' nature. It wasn't perfect, but it was, Vera thought, profoundly human in its refusal to accept simple answers when complex truth was available, and that was worth documenting. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed something most species in the Concordat had to learn the hard way. Humanity isn't defined by what they'll do to you, but by what they'll endure within themselves. If you found this story meaningful, consider subscribing. There are more tales from the Concordat archives waiting to be told. Next time, when a human colony ship disappears for 40 years and returns with impossible technology, the Concordat must answer a question they never wanted to ask. What did humans find in the dark between stars, and what did it cost them? Until then, endure.